4 days after my grandmother died. My parents, who threw me out at 18, walked into her estate meeting smiling and learned she had left me $3.5 million. They had changed the locks, left my suitcases on the porch, and disappeared for 11 years. Now my mother squeezed my hand like nothing happened and whispered, "Of course, we'll manage it for you." I laughed. She thought the money had put me back under her control. What she didn't know was that Grandma anticipated this moment. Months later, a judge turned one page, started reading, and my mother's smile vanished before he finished. Growing up, our house looked normal from the street. Trimmed hedges, a clean driveway, family photos lined up on the hallway wall like proof that everything inside was fine. But in our kitchen, love always came with numbers. My mother, Diane, managed budgets for a living, and she carried that habit home. If she bought me a winter coat, she reminded me what it cost. If she paid for a school trip, she mentioned it again months later. My father, Michael, usually sat at the table with his coffee, quiet, letting her words settle over the room. Grandma Evelyn was different. She lived a few streets away in a small house on Magnolia Street, where the kitchen always smelled like coffee and cut flowers. She had owned a flower shop for years, and even after retirement, she kept roses in old jars by the sink, at her table. Nobody kept score. When I was 17, Grandma had a health scare, nothing that stopped her from paying her own bills, driving herself to appointments, or arguing over grocery prices. But Mom saw an opening. She started saying Grandma needed help managing things. Then she started talking about taking control of Grandma's finances. A court investigator came to the house and asked me what I had seen. I could have lied. I knew what Mom wanted me to say. Instead, I told the truth. Grandma was sharp, independent, fully aware of her money and her choices. The request went nowhere. Mom barely spoke to me afterward. A few weeks after I turned 18, I came home from work and my key would not turn. I tried again. Then I looked down. 2 suitcases sat beside the front door. My father was visible through the narrow glass panel, standing in the hallway. He saw me. He did not open the door. Mom spoke through it instead. "You made your choice. That was all." I remember the rough suitcase handle cutting into my palm as I walked through the evening cold toward Grandma's house. I remember thinking 18 was supposed to feel like freedom. It did not. Grandma opened the door before I knocked twice. She looked at the suitcases, then at me. She did not ask what I had done. She stepped aside and said, "Come in, honey," before closing the door. She reached for the switch beside the frame. The porch light came on. That light stayed part of my life for the next 11 years. I finished school, built a career, learned how to live without expecting calls on birthdays or invitations at Thanksgiving. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, Linda Parker, Grandma's neighbor, called me at work. Her voice was shaking. "Celine, sweetheart." "Evelyn passed this morning." I asked the first question that came into my head. "Do my parents know Linda went quiet?" Then she said, "They've been here since breakfast." I drove to Magnolia Street with both hands locked around the wheel. Grandma's porch light was still off in the afternoon sun, but my mother's car was already in the driveway. Inside, Diane stood at the green kitchen table with neat stacks of papers spread around her. Payments, bills, property records, account statements. My father was opening drawers like he had been asked to inventory a store. Grandma had been dead less than a day. "Celine," Mom said, too brightly, "we're just getting organized." I looked at her. Organized for what she did not answer. At the funeral 2 days later, she wore black, held my arm, and introduced me to relatives as our daughter like the last 11 years were a scheduling conflict. Then she leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume. "We should talk after this. About what happens next. What happens next? Not grief, not Grandma, property." A few days later, we sat in Rebecca Hayes's office. Mom arrived with a leather folio on her lap. Dad kept smoothing his tie. Rebecca read slowly. Grandma's house, her commercial property, investments, cash. The total came to $3.5 million. Almost all of it went to me. Mom and Dad were each left a small amount. For a second, nobody moved. My ears rang so loudly I barely heard Rebecca continue. Then Mom reached over and covered my hand with hers. "Of course, we'll manage it for you." She said it softly, comfortingly, like Grandma had left me a problem and my parents had graciously volunteered to take it away. I pulled my hand back. "No, just one word." Mom smiled anyway. That smile stayed with me. 3 nights later, she invited me to dinner. I knew better. I went anyway. That is the humiliating part. The roast smelled exactly like childhood. Dad asked about my work. Mom remembered the pie I used to beg for on birthdays for almost an hour. No one mentioned Grandma or money, and something stupid inside me started hoping. Maybe grief had changed them. Maybe 11 years had finally cost them something too. Then Mom cleared the dessert plates and placed a thick financial plan in front of me. Their proposal was simple. The properties and investments would be placed under a family structure. Mom and Dad would manage everything. I would receive scheduled distributions. I stared at the signature line. "You already made this." Mom folded her hands. "We're trying to protect you. From what? From making emotional decisions with money you've never handled before." There it was, not reconciliation. Supervision. I closed the papers. "I'm not signing this." Dad looked down at his coffee. Mom's face barely changed. Only her voice did. "We tried to do this kindly." I stood up. "No, you tried to make it easy." I left the papers on the table and walked out. 3 weeks later, Rebecca called me before sunrise. My parents had formally challenged Grandma's estate plan. And this time, they were not asking for permission. The papers accused me of 2 things: that Grandma had not understood what she was signing, and that I had used my work in healthcare to influence her. I read that sentence 3 times. I had never been Grandma's therapist. I never managed her medication. I never touched her medical records. I was her granddaughter. But once a lie is written in legal language, it looks expensive enough to scare people. Then the calls started. An aunt asked why I had taken everything. Megan texted, "You could fix this by being fair." By the end of the week, she had stopped answering me. At my deposition, my parents' attorney, Daniel Brooks, spoke so gently it almost made things worse. He asked about my visits with Grandma, whether I drove her places, whether we talked privately. Then he looked down at his notes. "Ms. Bennett, did you receive behavioral health treatment at 19? My stomach dropped. That had been one of the hardest weeks of my life. I had asked for help, gotten it, and moved forward. My parents had known. For 11 years, they had kept it in a drawer. A few days later, a complaint reached my licensing board and my employer until it could be reviewed. My patient work was reduced, so was my paycheck. That was when fear finally became practical. Rent, legal bills, groceries, savings disappearing one quiet withdrawal at a time. Then Dad came to Grandma's house alone. He stood under the porch light with both hands in his jacket pockets. For once. He talked about Mom. Her mother had died broke when Diane was young. There had been unpaid bills, collection letters, years of cleaning up what was left behind. "She thinks control is safety," Dad said. For 1 second. I understood her, then he ruined it. Give her something. Celine. Enough to make her stop. I stared at him. "You came here to negotiate for her." He looked away. 3 days later, Mom sent me a letter. Sunday dinners, holidays, my old room if I wanted it. Family again. All I had to do was share control of the estate. Then came the formal settlement. $700,000. I could make the lawsuit stop. My savings were almost gone. My work was uncertain. I sat at Grandma's green table with a pen in my hand and came closer to signing than I want to admit. Then Linda knocked. Carol stood behind her holding a pie. Neither woman asked what the papers were. Linda sat across from me and looked at the signature line. "If you have to pay them to love you this time," she said quietly, "what will they charge you next time I put the pen down?" The next morning. I told Rebecca there would be no settlement. She opened a thick folder. Grandma's medical evaluations, her estate timeline, Claire's care notes, Dr. Reed's records, witness names. Then Rebecca rested her hand on one final page. "Your grandmother also left a signed statement explaining exactly why she made this plan. Can I read it?" Rebecca shook her head. "Not yet. Months later." The next person to hold that page would be Judge Moore, and my parents would be sitting 10 feet away when she read it aloud. The hearing lasted 2 days. By lunch on the first, I understood why people settle even when they believe they are right. Daniel made ordinary things sound calculated. I drove Grandma to appointments. I visited often. I worked in healthcare. I inherited $3.5 million. Placed side by side, the facts looked different than they had lived. Mom testified in a navy suit, holding a tissue she barely used. "We were worried about Evelyn," she said, "and about Celine. She has always been sensitive." Sensitive. That was the word she chose for 11 years of silence, working, finishing school, building a career, and learning how to survive without parents. Then Megan testified. She would not look at me. She said I had become very close to Grandma near the end and that I kept family matters private. Both statements were technically true. That was what made them hurt. When court ended that afternoon, Mom walked past me with Daniel and gave me a small, confident smile. For the first time, I wondered if she actually believed she was going to win. The next morning, Rebecca called me first. I took the stand and kept both hands folded in my lap. Daniel had wanted my past to arrive like an explosion, so I brought it in myself. When I was 19, I went through a mental health crisis. I said, I asked for help. I received treatment. Then I went back to school, finished my degree, and built my life. The courtroom stayed quiet. There is nothing shameful about that, I added. And it has nothing to do with what my grandmother chose to do with her property. Daniel's favorite weapon suddenly looked much smaller. Then the timeline began. Rebecca showed that Grandma's estate plan had existed for years. The final changes had been signed long before her last illness. Dr. Reed testified that Grandma understood exactly what she owned, who her beneficiaries were, and what her decisions meant. Claire testified next. Was Celine responsible for Evelyn's medical care? Number medication, no. Clinical decisions, no. Financial paperwork, no. Then Rebecca testified about her own meetings with Grandma. Every important conversation had happened privately. I had not been in the room by the time Linda took the stand. Daniel's story had started coming apart. She told Judge Moore about the porch light, how it came on every evening after I was thrown out, how Grandma once told her the light was there so I would always know which house would open for me. Mom shifted in her chair. Then Judge Moore looked down at the estate papers. There is one additional statement of intent attached to this plan. My pulse jumped. Rebecca did not turn toward me. The judge turned the page. Mom was still smiling. Judge Moore began reading Grandma's words. She described the old attempt by Michael and Diane to take control of her finances. She described me, at 17, telling the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Then came the line that changed the room. My granddaughter did not receive my estate because she controlled me. She receives it because, when others tried to control me, she was the one person who refused. Mom's smile froze. Judge Moore kept reading. My son and his wife have repeatedly confused management with ownership. I do not want them managing my property after my death any more than I wanted them managing my life before it. Dad turned toward Daniel. Mom's fingers tightened around her pen. Then the judge referenced the no contest provision. That was when their smiles vanished. Mom stood before Daniel could stop her. We raised her for 18 years. She snapped. She cannot act like she owes us nothing. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Judge Moore looked at her for a long moment, and I knew Mom had finally said out loud what this had always been about. Not protection, not Grandma, not even money, ownership. The judge upheld Grandma's estate plan. The challenge failed, and because of the way the contest had been brought, my parents also lost the small inheritance Grandma had left them. $3.5 million remained exactly where Grandma intended it to go. For the first time in 11 years, my mother had reached for control and closed her hand around nothing. Walking out of the courthouse did not feel like winning. It felt like setting down something I had been carrying since I was 18. The complaint against my professional license was closed a few weeks later. There was not enough evidence to support it. My employer restored my full schedule, and on my first morning back, one of my patients smiled when I walked into the room and said, "There you are." I had to look away for a second. Grandma's estate was eventually transferred according to her plan. I kept the house on Magnolia Street, not because it was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, because the first night I had nowhere else to go. That house had opened for me. The commercial property continued producing income, and I worked with Rebecca to create a small fund for family caregivers who needed temporary help with groceries, transportation, or a few days of respite care. No long applications, no lectures, no repayment. Grandma would have liked that part. Months passed before I heard from Dad. A plain envelope arrived with his handwriting on the front. Inside was a check for about $5,000. I stared at the amount until I understood. It was close to what Mom used to calculate as my share of household expenses when I was a teenager. There was one sentence on a folded piece of paper. I should have opened the door. I sat at Grandma's green table for a long time. Part of me wanted to call him. Another part wanted to tear the check in half. I did neither. I deposited it into the caregiver fund. That was the closest I could come to turning an old debt into something useful. I never reconciled with Mom. For years, I thought setting a boundary meant I had failed to forgive. Now I understand those are different things. You can understand someone's pain without volunteering to become the place they put it. The following spring, Linda introduced me to Emily, a 19-year-old student going through a family crisis of her own. I had a spare bedroom. She needed time, so I charged her almost nothing and handed her a key. That first evening, I heard the old timer inside the hall closet. Click, 7 o'clock. The porch light came on. Emily looked through the window. "Do you always leave that on?" I smiled. Every night, 11 years earlier. I had stood outside a locked door holding 2 suitcases. Now I was standing on the other side of one. And this time, I opened it. For a long time, I thought Grandma's greatest gift was $3.5 million. I was wrong. It was the porch light. It taught me that real love does not keep receipts, demand control, or charge interest years later. Sometimes protecting yourself means accepting that family and access are not the same thing. If you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, tell me your story in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe, because sometimes the hardest door to close is the one you spent years waiting to reopen.